Well, I mean, I sort of backed into law because I didn't want to teach French, which I was studying at the time. I didn't think I had much of a head for business. And I thought, well, I'll go into law. My grandfather was a lawyer, but I always thought law would be very dry. When I got into it at the University of Toronto, I really enjoyed it. And criminal law was always what interested me. And I was very lucky because I got to know through friends who were involved themselves some really very fine criminal defense lawyers. The principal one being a man by the name of Arthur Maloney, who had a tremendous impression, made a tremendous impression on many of us, and influenced us a great deal. Now, in the end, of course, I went through law school and I articled for a very fine criminal defense lawyer, Robert Carter.
What does that mean? Is that like an internship when you say article?
Yes, at that time to complete your professional training, you had to do a year of what we called articling. In other words, working for a lawyer. So I was very lucky to work for Robert Carter, who's now deceased. So is Arthur Maloney, for that matter. But anyway, to make a long story short, I got into. I started working with the Ombudsman at the time. That was Arthur Maloney. I worked for the Ombudsman for 2 years and then went into the downtown Crown Attorney's office in Toronto. And that's where you learn fast on your feet because you're in court all the time. You don't have a lot of time to prepare and there's a big volume of cases and you see the underbelly of the city in which you live. But I mean, I loved that work. I went from the downtown Crown Attorney's office into an office called the Crown Law Office Criminal, which dealt with organized crime, white-collar crime, but principally criminal appeals. And I worked there from 1985, and it was when I was there that I got the opportunity to go overseas to work at the Rwanda Tribunal, International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda.
How did that just happen?
Not exactly. I speak French. And part of my education was Laval University in Quebec City. And I took cases along with one or two other of my colleagues before the Court of Appeal for Ontario in French. And one of the judges who sat on our cases was Justice Louise Arbour. And when she became prosecutor of the Rwanda Tribunal and the Yugoslav Tribunal, I met her at a big function. It was a retiring Chief Justice, and there were about 1,000 lawyers there, and I was there, and I saw her, and I congratulated her on her appointment, because I knew her as a counsel, having appeared before her, and I just couldn't resist asking her, do you need any prosecutors? And she said, I don't know, we'll talk. This was all in French. So a few months later, I had occasion to speak to her, and she said there must be some kind of mental telepathy going on because she had been thinking of me. Because of my language abilities and because of the background I had, she said, would you ever consider working for the Rwanda Tribunal? Well, of course, in that instant I was already taken, but I had to sort of square it with my family. But that's how I got into it. I thought I was going to go to Kigali and work in Arusha in Tanzania for a year. It went to 2 years, and then I left there to go to the Yugoslav Tribunal for 3 years. Thought I was done with that, but a few years later I applied for and got the position as Senior Appeals Counsel back at the Rwanda Tribunal, this time in Arusha, and did that for 3.5 years. Went back to my Crown Law Office Criminal, thinking that was the end of it. I had a friend who worked, I'd met in the Rwanda Tribunal, who wrote me an email and said, have you considered applying for the position of Deputy Prosecutor at the ICC? And that's really where it started.
What drew you to that? I mean, here Fatou had been just appointed.
Right.
And obviously she was the deputy. So therefore the vacancy, how does it work?
Well, I mean...
How do you apply?
Well, that's a good question, because the process for me was a completely alien one. You apply, and
I mean, to fill out a form.
Yes, there's a frightful form that you have to go through. I went through 2 interviews along with other candidates, and in the end, under the statute, the Rome statute, Fatou has to pick 3 candidates, and she picked 3, and I was one of them, and she presented them to the Assembly of States parties, which then had to make a choice. And you had to get, I guess, just an absolute majority. At the time, it would be 61 out of 121. There were only, at that time, 121 states parties. So I needed to get 61 votes, but of course at the Assembly of States Parties session in November of 2012, only about not quite 90 states parties actually came. So that it wasn't a question of getting sort of 50 plus votes, you had to get 75% of the votes. So it took a little while, but eventually it happened. So I got the news that I had been elected deputy prosecutor on the same day that my wife became a Canadian citizen. So it was a bumper day for us and our family.
What was she?
Kenyan.
Kenyan.
She is Kenyan, but she has adopted Canada as her country. I sometimes think of myself as the anchor in The Hague, because the prosecutor is called upon to travel a great deal. She plays a vital diplomatic role. She has access to heads of state. She's the one who goes to the Security Council to report on the cases, or the situations, I should say, that have been referred to the office by the prosecutor, by the Security Council. So she has a very high level role to play. She is the face of the OTP. So I think for her, it's important to have somebody who's quite happy to sort of work out of the limelight and to run things, if you will, on her behalf, and of course keeping her fully informed, run the office at home. So my job as deputy prosecutor is to manage the three great divisions in the office: the Jurisdiction, Complementarity and Cooperation Division, or JCCD as we call it, the Investigations Division, and the Prosecution Division. So they are under my oversight, my supervision, if you will, and the heads of those divisions report to me and through me to the prosecutor. But we're not that formal in terms of our hierarchy. It's a much more flexible kind of interaction, but that's my responsibility. There's a lot of things that I'm involved with sort of day to day, but generally it's the big initiatives and the general oversight of how the office is operating.
What does Robert Jackson mean to a James Stewart?
Well, he's an inspiration, and I can say that because, well, for a number of reasons. For one thing, last year I had the opportunity to visit Nuremberg. I was involved in a conference. I don't get involved in too many of these things, but I was involved in this particular one, and with my family, we toured the marvelous museum that's been set up sort of behind. It was part of the complex, the court where these trials were held. So, of course, it brings you back right into connection with that time. But the other thing is that I remember very well. In fact, I watch from time to time, just because I enjoy it, that wonderful movie Judgment at Nuremberg with Spencer Tracy. And what comes across in a film like that, but I think also, frankly, in the efforts of a person like Robert H. Jackson, is the fundamental decency of the democracy, if you will, of the culture, the democratic culture that's been developed in the United States, in Canada, in other countries of the same persuasion, if you will, and the notion of right and wrong and what just can't be. So to me, that kind of moral but also very pragmatic approach to things is right. And so I enjoy learning about a person like Robert Jackson, because he had that sense of, what's right in the world. You just can't do some things, and if you do, then there's going to be an accounting. And the notion that you will have an accounting in a reasonably serene environment in which evidence is presented and people's voices are heard, as opposed to simply grabbing a bunch of people, lining up against a wall and shooting them and saying they're good riddance, is valuable.